voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns on the ground, in other words, they have a larger menu of political options in the urban provinces, are more likely to find a political home, be mobilized to vote through campaigning and actually turn out at elections. This is in contrast to the rural provinces, where rural voters have begun to withdraw from voting in far greater proportions to urban voters. And we put this down to the possibility that these voters have less exposure to campaigns on the ground, and this is largely because opposition parties, the smaller parties, haven't got the resources and the ability to penetrate the rural provinces to the extent that they can in the bigger urban centres. And this leaves rural voters with a smaller choice from which to choose, and if they have become disillusioned with the ANC, they begin to withdraw their support, but they do not shift their support and they become abstainers. Now, if we look at partisanship, party loyalties, we know that people with a strong party loyalty are more easily mobilized and tend to turn out to vote compared to non-partisans who are far harder to mobilize. And this decline in partisanship that we see in South Africa was quite pronounced in 2019. In other words, more South Africans than ever state that they do not feel close to a particular political party. And so they lack this psychological anchor in the political world that guides them on their voting choice and to participate at elections. So what this basically means is that this reliance using a traditional party queue is disappearing from the South African electorate. And it means that South African political parties and actors are going to have to work far harder to mobilize this growing group of voters to come to the polls. People tend to vote if they are encouraged to do so by the relationships that they have, their social networks, and the membership that they hold. So they are receiving political communication from their social networks which encourage them and create a social desirability to turn out to vote. We know, for example, that somebody is far more likely to vote if their partner or spouse voted. They are far more likely to vote if they belong to a membership of a trade union or church or political party membership. And it's this sort of network that should be utilized in South Africa to encourage people to the polls. And I'm not suggesting that those networks push a partisan message, but one more of civic-mindedness, that voting is civic, it's a civic duty, it's a responsibility, and that it's an opportunity to actually formulate policy and change governments. But unfortunately, we also know that young people are less likely to be part of social and organizational networks. And this is one of the reasons why young people are traditionally quite difficult to mobilize to vote. They lack these social networks until later adulthood. We also know from the data that we ran for this paper that, in fact, if somebody feels discontented with government's overall performance, they are more likely to vote. Now, this was a very interesting finding because it suggests that, in fact, people look at elections as a sanctioning mechanism. They are using elections to reward or punish governments, incumbents, as they see fit. And this presents another strategy, another tactic for electoral players. We should be utilizing the discussions around government's performance and political party performance to mobilize people to come to the polls. If people are discontented, they need to understand that elections are there to lodge that dissatisfaction. But having said that, that's one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy is to couple that with positive, progressive policy platforms and leadership quality, because that is the other half of the equation that is missing for voters. We can have discussions about whether we are content or discontented with government's performance and how that could be improved. But without presenting credible political alternatives, voters are still left bereft. They do not have alternative political homes to move their support to. And what we've seen in the data in South Africa for quite some time now is an increasing mistrust of the ANC. For example, in 2006, trust in the African National Congress-led government was at 62%. By 2018, Afrobarometer recorded that at 38%, quite a dramatic decline. Yet, a substantial proportion of South African voters do not perceive credible political alternatives elsewhere. And as a result of that, they are ultimately withdrawing from the electorate. They are not casting a vote.